Okay, so we're going to start the second part of this afternoon event called Anthropocene and Unbuilt, while the crowd slowly comes back. But I'll do the introduction from Mark. It's a great pleasure to have Mark with us at the AA. Mark Jason Beck is a professor of history and theory of architecture at the MIT. In America, has published books and articles on a wide range of historical topics from the 12th century to the modern era, with a particular focus on 19th and 20th century philosophy and architecture. He's a leading advocate for global history and has published several books and articles on that topic, including the ones in our unit shelf. So if you're interested, just have a look at the library. Including the groundbreaking textbook entitled A Global History of Architecture, with co-author Vikram Prakash, and with the noted illustrator Francis D.K. Ching. His current book project is entitled Thinking About Architecture. So please help me welcome Mark.
I want to thank Ricardo and Nanette for the invitation to speak to you today. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time actually inside the AA. I'm also speak to you as an architect. I do have an architectural degree and a practice of sorts, and probably if we're talking about the Anthropocene and the Unbuilt, I'm not sure I know everyone in the audience, but I can probably venture to say that I'm the only person here who has not built, I mean, I have designed, but not built a city in China for half a million people. The Chinese wanted it done in 3 months. And Ricardo, have you, anybody know anybody here who might have matched me on a 3-month? I mean, that's the scale in which you have to build these days in China. Fortunately, it was not built. So, I mean, I could talk about the unbuilt if you want, but I'm going to talk today a very theoretical question, or what actually some people might call theory, but I would prefer something else. So I was thinking about the challenge today on the question of the Anthropocene. I thought I would discuss it, but in a very oblique point of view. But we'll come around to architecture sort of at the end. I want to pull the word apart, Anthropocene, and concentrate on the anthro. And the purpose, of course, is not to challenge Anthropocene, but to insist that we take the anthro part of that word very seriously and challenge what I call anthrocentrism. And I do not want anthrocentric Pocene, which I think we might be getting. So what do I mean by anthrocentrism? The story begins, and the problem as well, if we want to have to put actually a finger on it, with Spinoza, who's a 17th century Dutch philosopher, who argued that God was not some sort of anthropomorphic being who spoke words of magical wisdom to us mortals. So here he is. He did not send signs to guide us or miracles to impress us, nor did he busy himself with the busy work of writing in Hebrew and Greek, otherwise known as sort of the Bible. Spinoza, he argued that the God was, in essence, something we might call equivalent of nature. That the religion itself was a conveniently created story propped up by the religious institutions for political benefit. This is in the 17th century. Now, Spinoza was accused by the Catholics, the Protestants, and the Jewish authorities of Holland of being an atheist, and he barely got away with his life. So clear-headed was his argument that it's difficult for us fully to evaluate and appreciate the nature of his bravery. But before we look at him as a progenitor of modern secularism, indeed, some people have argued that, and pride ourselves on our own alleged superiority to that effect, we have to remember that he was no atheist. God existed for Spinoza in the form of nature as something that did not care really for us in our daily human life. There's an argument known as immanence as opposed to transcendence. Deleuze, who writes on the concept of the plane of immanence, deals directly with and goes back to the Spinozian moment as a sort of a source for a type of a project that he's interested in. And he identifies the problem as such. Philosophy would find its difference or true beginning not in an agreement with the pre-philosophical image, capital I, You can read that as God. But in the rigorous struggle against the image, which it would denounce as non-philosophical. Now, as Deleuze points out, philosophy after Spinoza as a conversation by man about man could only now begin. But, as Deleuze also points out, this is only because God is placed in essence above a glass ceiling. He is reduced to image with a capital I, meaning that God is somehow still there, floating around, but his fearsome voice has been removed, and therefore for me lies the nub of the problem of a certain strangeness that I want to talk about today. So the shift from anthropomorphism to anthropocentrism created not just a new type of man, but a new type of God. And let us not forget that when the term anthropomorphism was first used in 1753, it was not in reference to secularism, but in Spinozian manner, in reference to the presumed heresy of applying a human form to the Christian God. So we can trace a thin but yet very important thread from Spinoza's God, the God of the not speaking, but all-powerful nature, to Derrida's critique of logocentrism that gives priority to speech over writing. It is the human who writes, not God, whereas God can assert himself, if he wants, with words. But this gets us a little bit ahead of the problem. So before I want to get to the core of my argument, which is to focus rather narrowly on the problem of the enforcement of silence, I need to point out that in Spinoza, there are two types of non-philosophical silenced creatures. One, of course, is the logocentric God. The other lives among us. Spinoza differentiates himself in particular from the vulgus, the multitude, or the common people. Well, I'm going to presume all of us belong to that. Now, let me not bemoan the fact that when Spinoza discusses democracy, he excludes foreigners, women, and servants. Those were the days. But that does not remove the sticky problem of what to make with the concept vulgus, which lingers on in the anthrocentric worldview. So to be blunt, the only way to move forward to something like a, quote, secular, post-theological society in the post-Spinozian world is to perform a twofold move. One, to not remove God, to perform a Promethean-esque type of trick, silencing the deity, as if such a strange thing can ever even be done, given the fact that it's just as much a fantasy to think that God cannot speak as to assume that he could. And then to differentiate a supposedly higher form of human existence from a lower one. Thus was born the abstraction of man, with capital M, in the self-embrace of self-critique. Kant and Hegel both tried to solve some of the perplexing issues that Spinoza created. Spinoza's political philosophy left much to be desired. Kant's answer was to say that we should not just sort of jump into a sort of a political solution. Instead, with God present, but muted out of the conversation, a philosophy for Kant should first become a type of anthropology, a condition of man studying man. Kant transformed anthropomorphism as a negative into anthropology as a positive. And I show here his anthropology of from a pragmatic point of view. It's really entertaining reading. It really is. I mean, you should all get it and read it. I mean, it's hilarious. Now, this is not the hard science of today's anthropology, with its alienated from any kind of political, practical purposes. But as it says, a study of man based on the presumption of what we might call today lived experience and oriented to the goals of the much anticipated enlightenment of all. Right? Now, of course, when there's lived experience, it means sort of Kant's opinions about things. Right? This is very chatty. So let's read what he says about wine. Wine, which merely stimulates, and beer, which is more nourishing and satisfies like food, are both intoxicants, but with this difference, that drinking bouts with beer tend to make the guest dreamy and taciturn, which is, of course, not good, and often boorish. Oh, my God. Whereas revels with wine are gay, noisy, talkative, and witty, which, for him, are good. So, if you ever, dinner conversation is wine over beer, there's definitely wine over beer. Right? Beer is down the road, right? I presume it's wine here. I don't know. Yeah, but, there's much to be said for softening our judgment, right? So he wants us not to be always sort of the horrid rationalists. He wants us to sometimes to let loose a little bit. But he says, but it's very easy to overlook and overstep the borderline of self-control. For the host wants his guest to leave satisfied by his statement of sociability. So this is what he means by anthropology, right? It's sort of, how are we supposed to talk to each other, right? Now that God is sort of, behind the curtain, not listening and not telling us what to do and how to talk and what mumbo jumbo we're supposed to say on Sunday, well, all of a sudden we have to have things like dinner conversations, and we should know how to do that. Now, even here in this innocent example, we see the problem expanding like a cancer over the body of reason. The problem at the core of the post-Spinozian worldview of man as a self-abstraction, as an individual who has to adhere to the premise of self-control in social environments, and as man who identifies the lowlifes, who always seem to goof things up. Now, Kant identifies these specifically with terms like blockheads, boors, naives, the drunks in the pub. They're creating a long list of human failures, along with those who mistake understanding for superstition and knowledge for religion. So superstition is always sort of the key word, of the antagonism. Now, as to the uninformed hordes of people in the street, those people right out there, Kant simply referred to them as das Publikum, a dismissive word. A chapter in my book is on the dismissal of the public. So enlightenment self-control has to be performed precisely in the self-mirroring reflection of the silent others who are designed to lack reflection. Now, the great thing about Kant, however, is that when I start to begin this process of magical enlightenment, I'm speaking with people, as he says, right, with the wine and glass in hand. I'm speaking. He loved dinner parties. He had a dinner party at his house practically every night. He would invite people over. It was always between, he just said the best dinner parties are between more than three people and less than 9. So forth. He had long, elaborate rules about that. He had actually a little syllabus of conversations you're supposed to talk about. First, you're supposed to talk about the weather, because he felt that the weather conditioned your inner organ flow of your juices, right? And if it was cold weather, you would have to respond differently with your inner juices than with outer. Things like that. Yeah. At any rate, that's his anthropology. But ultimately, he says you have to give up socializing to produce what he calls concepts. So now, by externalizing our thoughts through concepts, so Kant argues, our ideas firm up and develop into lifespans of their own that can guide us through difficult times, so to speak. Concepts do the work of communication, even though they represent the past participle of the human-to-human contact. They are not laws, but they act like laws. As free people, we're supposed to then release ourselves into the realm of concepts with God's tacit approval, I should add. Since God, for Kant, even though he couldn't speak, stood in front of us as the most important concept of all, justice. So my goal, once again, is to follow the traces of the philosophical legitimation of the type of speech construction that produces a culture of speech denial in the Anthropocenic anthropological world. Kant's realm of the concepts allows one to stop speaking to each other. And in fact, the better our concepts, the less we need to talk. In some magical Kantian future, all we do is politely nod to each other while sipping wine at a dinner party. The problem, of course, is the blockheads out that window, and Kant nowhere gives any indication of what one's supposed to do with them. Perhaps Kant was thinking of his own manservant, Mr. Lampe, Herr Lampe, who delivered to Kant the newspaper every morning. Very punctually, he was a former soldier. To Kant's great irritation, Lampe always mispronounced Hartungsjournal as Hartmann's journal. Kant would say, Herr Lampe, repeat after me 3 times. Is this Hartungsjournal? Anyway, Kant eventually fired him. But the point is that such blockheads for Kant, real or imagined, are structurally necessary to the anthropological viewpoint. Hegel argued that Kant's ideas on the society that serves as an anthropedagogical, self-correcting environment was impractical, since it was much too slow, if one wanted ever to reach enlightenment. So he moved away from the anthropologism of Kant to an anthropocentrism in the form of the grand alliance between being, nation, and God. For this to work, self-surveillance has to come from within us, from deep within us, from within the core dialectic that resides within us and that imports, without that we have any choice in the matter, all the stabilizing forces necessary for life. These include nation-state, customs, and religion. Hegel could care less if your faith was real or not, but he did want you to go to church. And if you did not go to church, he at least wanted the church building to be visible in the landscape. In other words, there was the institutionality about Hegel. He said, I don't really care. We're much too rational to actually believe in this stuff. But somehow the low folk, they need that to, otherwise there'd be chaos, right? So for Hegel, I do not need speech at all, much less to need to work on the art of listening, talking, and hearing. That dialectic does it all, telling me more or less what to do. As Hegel phrased it, when speaks the soul? Alas, the soul no longer speaks. Hegel's philosophy was thus solidly opposed to the principle of intercommunication. He was, after all, a school teacher, and that means that he was used to a world where the teacher told the pupils what to think. It was sort of a sad moment, I think, for Western philosophy when school teachers become global historians. Anyway, what I'm trying to argue is that the birth of the Anthropocene coincided with the birth of the European anthropocentrism. The two went hand in hand, which is why I argue that the Anthropocene has little to do with the Industrial Revolution and how many carbon molecules there are in the air. That mistakes the effect for the cause. The anthropocentrism was built around a philosophically legitimated absence of what might be called simply conversationality. We do not need to speak. Nature speaks, or speaks with or for us, or it allows us to elevate ourselves even on the backs of it as an abstraction. Now, if the metaphysics of theology that was rejected as a form of superstition, the metaphysics of the so-called Enlightenment required that we identify the boundary between a human and a not-so-human human. Needless to say, the Enlightenment philosophers, if for Kant it was the blockheads, and for Hegel it was the foreigners and aliens. Those without any homeland discovered the not-so-human in all of this was timed conveniently, of course, to coincide with colonialism. Now, in the colonial era, at the same time that Europeans pretended to purify themselves from superstitions, the blockheads and other aliens, they met their historical predecessors in unfamiliar territories, but armed with philosophically grounded protocols of reification. They first called these people pagans and barbarians. And then in the early 20th century, into the 20th century, they called them primitives and savages. And then more recently, they call them hunter-gatherers and foragers. Concepts that, though entrenched into the anthropological discipline today, I mean, and here you see the most nastiest of books, right? The Cambridge Encyclopedia of Hunters and Gatherers are nothing less than the symptoms of the continuing arrogance of the anthrocentric viewpoint. But this arrogance that plays itself out in the outside of European culture primarily, also, as I've tried to show, plays itself out on the inside of European culture as well, with its philosophically sanctioned fable vulgus, who stand in for the irredeemably unenlightened and the irredeemably silenced. Now, we can clearly recognize that post-Spinozian worldview still lingers within us, not only in philosophy, but almost in everyday practice, especially in architecture. First, we can look at Heidegger, who contrasts the Ich-Bin people, who are the good, from the lowly truck drivers, who, for him, represent the all-too-mobile world in modern civilization. Then we can see the same in Adorno, who, afraid that we're all going to become fascist, demanded that art form an anthropologically self-critical elevation for us in good fashion over the implicit terror of popular culture. He wanted nothing less than the Wahrheitsgehalt, Schönberg good, Stravinsky bad. Greenberg pitted the great abstract artists against the specter of kitsch. Abstraction, he argued, was the sign of aesthetic restraint necessary for the enlightened future. Kitsch was little more than the symptom of an over-industrialized world caught in the downward spiral. From Spinoza's vulgus onward, the Enlightenment has thrown us a vast array of variations of the unphilosophical, silenced others. In this muted world, this world of mutes, why bother listening and why bother communicating? The whole thing adds up to a bizarre psycho-philosophical nightmare. The grand era of anthropocentrism is coming to an end. History is catching up with it, if not with the global worldview. The premise of the nation states, the political bedrock of the modern anthropocentrism, is now increasingly under assault at the global scale. But more importantly, or just as importantly at least, the Holocene is now certainly in a post-Holocene phase, as some argue. The grand security of the Holocene, which is another anthrocentric concept from the late 19th century, and an outrageous one at that, is being destroyed by the epic problem and ambiguity of global warming. Even science has moved into a new era. Today, the scientists tell us there aren't 3 dimensions, there are not 4 dimensions, there are 15. And they have no way to understand that or explain it. The only thing that science can comfortably predict is that the weather will from now on be unpredictable. I suggest, it's like, okay, all right. I suggest that we return, therefore, to the Spinozian Kantian moment and think counterintuitively, if you will, counterhistorically, and a bit counterphilosophically. And instead of asking God to be present but silent, let us go in the other direction. Let's let God speak. After all, it's sort of written even in the United States Constitution that God is around, as you all know. We just had the Republican debate and half of it was about God. So let's let him speak. Give up. But let's let all the other gods speak too. Let me embrace what both the Christians and the Enlightenment people call superstition. Let's go even further. Let's listen to all the gods. Now, First Society people, or should I say are, or more likely in our generation were, since we're killing them off in our generation finally, continuously talking to and listening to their environment, rocks, clouds, water, winds, not to mention animals, birds, and ancestors and forests, all had voices. Let us just remember that the Incas, before they removed a stone from the quarry, first had to ask the mountains permission. And this is hopefully something that Rachel Armstrong will appreciate. The Inca word for stone was flesh. What we see in the Linnaean world as a mineral, passively waiting to be mined by the dispassionate, self-improving, property-owning Homo sapien, another anthrocentric nonsense, was for the Inca the living body of God. Similarly, the wood for the great Ise shrine in Japan cannot be chopped down from the forest without the priest first communicating with the forest spirits to make sure that such a violation is even permitted. Today, people who communicate with the spirits are known as schizophrenics. Deleuze and Guattari interpret schizophrenia as a communal symptom of capitalist society. But for the association of schizophrenia with sexuality and desire may be sort of interesting and titillating, but misses really a point. Schizophrenia is about hearing voices. It is not a symptom of modernity, but the residual manifestation of an ancient cognitive ability that almost, I would say, all of us have lost. So let me emphasize, the Anthropocene has happened. Did not go very well, producing ever greater escalations of presumptions. We are now moving into a post-Anthropocene, anthropocalyptic, perhaps, moment, where the very existence on the planet might be in doubt. Maybe it is time to think about listening. Maybe it is time to expand what we're listening to. I'm challenged in the arrogance of assuming that in the context of secularism, that there is a such thing as a God explicit or, in the secular world, sort of implicit, and yet visible in the landscape. One who is not removed even by the greatest of Western thinkers, Nietzsche and Deleuze included, precisely because it was needed as a foundational fantasy of remoteness. A remoteness, should I say, suited to the colonial world, a fantasy of a fantasy. As unbelievable as that may sound, that fantasy is no more plausible today than to say that there are multiple gods, multiple voices, and multiple speakers. I'm not arguing that we should be building out of thatch and mud brick, or that we should go to Siberia and become a shaman. I'm not arguing for neo-primitivism, nor am I saying that some Shinto ritual is the answer. After all, we more or less know that when the Shinto priests asked for divine permission to chop down 13,000 cedar trees for the Ise shrine, the answer is in a foregone conclusion. Obviously, yes. Well, that's not really, is speaking or listening. So how do we move past the castrational impulse and performative guilt that yields nothing but the eternal return of modernism and its manufactured self-satisfactions? Now I show here the German pavilion. Well, I'm going to leave the one below a little bit for another discussion. But I show here the German pavilion by Schildhuber and Kendall from the Shanghai Expo. Now, according to the website, the architecture integrates innovative and intelligent materials which can take on several functions and increase the building's sustainability. Sounds like a plausible text, but read from reverse, and to not put too fine a point on it, this is a typical anthrocentric text for an anthrocentric building. Architecture here is the form of a disciplinary flagellation, envisions the ground from which all possibilities are possible in the name of an all-empowered, impossibly abstract human, and I would say largely Eurocentric human. It stands as the fortress against a global world. It claims to be emission-generated, neutral, dispassionate, and yet in claiming to do the right thing for the human cause, it pleasures itself on the bed of abstraction, standing in for a conversation, but in reality, suppressing it. Anthrocentrism here is anthroeroticism. And I'm sort of tempted by the anthroerotic component that if we can go in that direction, maybe okay, but they don't really get it. They're like believers. So I want to compare that with the Nana Harbor Diner, Naha City, Japan, by Takeshi Hazama. According to the architect, the site for this restaurant, located between the city of Okinawa and the airport, lacked good ki, or quality. The tree was meant to compensate for this. The unexpected pairing of nature and artifice, the tree, after all, is made out of fiberglass and metal, plays on the difference between the natural and the man-made. The design, a parody or a real of a sacred tree, does not hide the restaurant in the tree, but launches it implausibly into the upper reaches, as if swept up there by a great tsunami. The restaurant in the tree is clearly a typical strip mall concrete building. One can even see the foundations of the building hovering implausibly overhead, modernity revealed, modernity uprooted, inverted, displaced. Perhaps modernity is a type of parenthesis to be discussed, held in sway by a giant tree. A small Buddhist shrine at the base of the thing completes the project. But is the shrine real or not? The building represents a gajumuro tree, often used for bonsai. The purpose of the bonsai tree is to serve as a point of contemplation for the viewer, to make it, its maker, when it makes it, uses it as an exercise of effort and ingenuity. Whereas the German pavilion is resolutely at the human scale, the scale of the puffed up human with a capital H, trying to dutifully purify itself in the performance, in the performative hypocrisy of man with a capital M. The tree here, though it also speaks about man and nature, is a maxi model of a mini model, a model of a model of model that destabilizes any certainty of what it is, and that allows all sorts of voices to be heard if only one hears them, whether Buddhist or faux Buddhist, whether real or faux shrine, whether modern or not modern, whether sacred tree or just a corporate logo, whether a departure for contemplation or just the busy highway on the strip mall in island in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So our fourth speaker now is Claudia Pasquero, who is an architect, author, and educator. And she's the co-founder and director of Ecologic Studio, which is an architectural and urban design studio involved in digital design and architecture research for the definition of new ecology of space and behavior. Co-founded in 2005 together with Marco Poletto, the studio has built up an international reputation for its innovative work on systemic design, a method defined by the combination and integration of systemic thinking, computational design, biohacking, and digital prototyping. This broadened approach to design, ranging from the micro to the macro, and from biotechnologies to urban networks is embodied into an experimental practice where projects and installations become laboratories of interactions. Welcome, Claudia.
Thanks. I'm glad of being here, and the talks before were really inspiring, and you can see I rewrote my text 10 times. No, now I'm completely confused, which somehow as a designer is a good place to be, so it should work out. Okay. So today I will try to address the theme proposed by Riccardo Nanette of the Anthropocene and the Unbuilt. For what concerns the Anthropocene, our interest at the moment is in discussing the relationship between what we call the urban sphere and the biosphere. And what we call the urban sphere, we had a lot of conversation with Rachel on what it is. We still don't know, but we will try to see. I will articulate this through a series of design experiments, some from my student in UCL and some from the office ecology studio. And on the Unbuilt part, I'm not sure, it's a bit paradoxical for me to talk about Unbuilt, not because I built much, but because for me, I cannot think without working with material articulation. It's impossible for me. So even when we are asked to write a manifesto, we actually work with material and start to articulate material. So we build even when we are not asked to build. Maybe what brings us nearer to the Unbuilt is the rhythm with which we build, because we tend to speculate a lot on what material are and how they are interconnected one with the other, with society and with ecology. So I will start my talk by looking at some data. This microphone is a bit high for me. So according to the Global Footprint Network, in 2015, the Earth Overshoot Day lands on August 13. In less than 8 months, humanity has therefore exhausted Earth's budget for the year. For the remaining days, we will maintain our ecological deficit by drawing down local resources stocks and accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In other words, we'll be operating in overshooting. We could argue that this is made possible by the existence of what we call urban sphere. The global apparatus of contemporary urbanity, a dense network of informational, material, and energetic infrastructure that sustain our increasingly demanding metabolism by offsetting the fluctuation and deficits of the natural biosphere in providing the required levels of resources in the right place at the right time. In my short talk, I will attempt to propose a model and a design method to articulate the behavior of the urban sphere and propose new terms for its sustainable coevolution with the biosphere. This model addresses principles of biological, computational, and social self-organization. This is a Viola Pass in Bolivia, as seen from the airport in El Alto. If we look at the same city from a satellite point of view, we realize that it's quite difficult to depict what is natural and what is artificial. This city, despite being large artificial system, often depicted as the antithesis of nature, develop patterns that seem to recall natural formation of a radical different kind. For us, they are complex and articulated systems. We can argue that city and their morphology are mostly determined by the flow of matter, information, and energy that fuel our metabolism, and that was said also by Mike today. So we would like to shift the attention from looking at urban form as a figure ground to the morphogenetic process that underpin the current morphology of the urban landscape. In the last 10-15 years, the contemporary world became globalized and interconnected to an incredible extent. And the flow of material, energy, and information feeding contemporary city now span continents and connect points across the biosphere as part of a resource-driven industry that is both necessary to the survival of our urbanizing society and detrimental to the wealth and well-being of its inhabitants. Well, we all need mines, power stations, landfill sites to support our urban metabolism. So here we are a key paradox. Today we shall talk on one large global urban sphere that robs the world over and exchanged to an incredible rate with the natural biosphere. But it has become almost impossible even to tell these two global systems apart. So our question becomes, how can we design the urban sphere so that it becomes more efficient, resilient, and adaptive? Can we reconceive it as the biocity of the future in such a way that it can operate as a co-evolutionary system with the biosphere? And if so, how? What could be a model for the biocity of the future and what form it might take? As designer, we try to look at different models, and we came across with our student to this model, the slime mold, or in scientific term, the Fusarium polycepharum. This is one of the simplest creatures on Earth, a protist. In fact, it is a single cell, just one cell. Now, how can one cell be a blueprint for a city? Well, this is not just any cell. Within this cell, we can find thousands, if not millions, of nuclei. They float in a protoplasmatic liquid. The whole thing is kept together by a membrane of actin. In the plasmonium phase, when enough nutrients are to be found, the membrane stretches to take virtually any shape. Not only, but the nuclei interact with each other and the environment via chemical reaction that generate gradient of pressure that regulate the protoplasmatic flow. It can locally sense the presence and amount of nutrients in a given place, react to it. It also leaves traces in the environment that constitute a form of spatial and distributed memory that the slime mold developed to optimize its behavior. So we became interested in what scientists discovered about slime mold. And it seems that this simplest of organisms can perform extremely sophisticated tasks, such as network optimization, nutrient regulation, event anticipation. And these are some of the tasks that urban systems perform at all time. But the way slime mold does it is unlike many urban design systems, as it is the product of emergent collective behavior and distributed spatial memory. So how can we explore this behavior materially in a real urban context? We decided to develop a new kind of urban design apparatus that we tested on a series of prototypical scenarios, both in the covered corridor in Arizona and in Liwa Oasis City in the Rubalcali. The apparatus enabled us to feed the slime mold with satellite data from the territory itself. In our design exploration, we are devising, these are some of the data, so we started to work with a set of satellite data and with ESA to transmit information to the slime mold. And in our exploration, we've been devising different ways of translating this information to this system of biological computing that could be in 3D printing, bio-3D printing, using colors as mixed with the nutrient, and matrix of LED. So what interests then we work with a set of high-resolution camera to transmit this information that were computed to some of our drawing. And what interests us is not necessarily in the final behavior, but transforming the idea of computing, networking city from an act of computing to an act of gardening and of interaction. It's not the final solution that interests us, but the behavior that is expressed. So to discuss this, I can show one.
The Liwa Oasis city is located at the Arabian Peninsula on the north edge of the Rubalcali Desert. Liwa Oasis is a self-organized territory which is strongly influenced by the distribution of scarce resources and topographic conditions in the desert. For this reason, we carried out research and experiment with the slime mold, which has similar behavior strategy with nomadic people. In the next step, we made the physiobiological network model to simulate the existing energy network, the water well system in Liwa Oasis. In order to make use of every drop of the slime mold and food due to the limited quantity, we created the biological printing part. Then the biological algorithm is applied to the Sabuka network, which is the most significant landscape and resource in Liwa area. Here is 220 hours model time to simulate the time from 2015 to 2030. The Sabuka analog model built a network between residents and Sabuka. When the slime mold moves to the Sabuka, it started to transfer and collect resource and then goes on, redistribute the resources from the residence part to the sepulchre part. This interface showed how the robots work according to the growth of slime mold. Each robot represents a large amount of robots in real territory, and they will be able to constitute the complex networks similar to slime mold. The observation of slime mold in the small scale indicate that the particles inside the structure of slime mold have the collective intelligence, which lead us to manipulate the digital simulation as comparison and supplement. By setting up the agents as a swarm robots gatherer and emit the collectible particles as the position of sepulchre, we build up the simulation of swarm robots collection behavior. In this simulation, we can clearly observe and analyze how the agents collecting materials and interact with the territory. Salt, fiber, starch, these are three materials that can be found on our site, and we combined them together to form a new material system. Fiber mixed with salt water provides the salt crystals that can be used as part of the structure. Then with starch, which can turn into bioplastic, we can build a complex structure with both strength and plasticity. The swarm robots, material distribution condition, and bioplastic composite structure will constitute a new dynamic ecological system.
As we continue with this type of experiment, we began to ask ourselves what kind of urban or architectural system might be able to provide such efficient, adaptive, and resilient exchange with the biosphere, this capacity to extract renewable resources efficiently and to fuel the urban metabolism in a diverse number of streams. This is something we explore in the office, but before I want to show another project of the student that explore this question of local production and untapped local resources.
The Biocement project looked into the possibility to harness local resources, such as water, wind, and sand, and involved the urban society fabric of Liver Oasis in United Arab Emirates. It is a research project that focuses on geomorphologic transformation. This trend inspired Biocement Lab to take local resources, such as sand and algae, to produce cancelated sand called biocement. The lab proposes it as a local material for self-construction in Liver Oasis. Research begins with analog and digital simulation experiment. The first category is exploring the relation between binder deposition parameters and dunes morphologies. Synthesized sand dunes were introduced in the second digital simulation, and geomorphology information extract from the site were also imported to the second analog experiment in order to specify the analog and digital simulation. Wind parameters were introduced in next category. The same as the last simulation category, it starts by digital simulation based on abstract parameters and set up wind tunnel to provide single direction wind for the physical analog. Wind's influence towards sand dunes were further explored by tracing the movement of sand dunes on the site of Liwa. The analog experiment using column mark record the process of sand dunes morphology transformation. Moreover, erosion phenomenon by wind inspired the next simulation of the fabric exploration. Digital simulation explains the process of erosion on abstract sand-based material. 3D print technology is the main application method that combined all the basic elements from previous explorations. Digital model was built upon sand dunes morphologies. Tool path that from the digital model is translated into the UR robot. The model is built by printing binder on sand layer by layer. Next, we introduce a drone as the territorial machine prototype, including drones with the function of sensor the territory, connection between drone and end effector, and so on. The urban protocol that based on the territorial machine is composed with two aspects, flying pattern and injection pattern. Firstly, the drone will fly asteroids to sensor the terrain and choose the windward area to inject binders. The binders will flow down along the sand dune slopes. Besides, drones can also get a data map of sand dune boundary and wind distribution on site. During the injection, binders' concentration area will influence by the wind distribution. Another part of the urban protocol that based on the interactive website is also composed with two aspects, voting or drawing the construction area. Finally, according to the fish pond location within the site, drones fly in 500 meters square to sensor the terrain and inject binder. Then the binder flow along the sand dune slopes. To show the more specific structure, we ran the detailed simulation on the sample site that had been chosen, using the 3 injection method and reconstructing the detailed part of the territorial morphology.
So this type of exploration on productive prototype is something that we explain exploring also with Ecology Studio. In particular, today I will talk about the urban algae folly, but not in particular about the project itself, but more about the lineage of research that is connected to that. A few years ago, we were asked by the municipality of Milan to look in what in Italian is called the filiera corta, meaning the short production lane that produce do between the moment in which they are packaged, produced, or cultivated and the moment they are consumed. Some of you might not, many of you might not know that Milan is the largest agricultural center in Italy, and in pretty much near the center there are a lot of farm integrated in the texture of the city. So what we did as a project, that actually also with AA visiting school at a certain point, was to map the product of this farm and where they were going. We distributed a series of QR codes on the product, and then we discovered something that was also not very difficult to predict. As Mike said before, many master plan, you have the elite in the center, and you have the outskirts, the rest of the world. And so this product were feeding 1% of the population of Milan approximately in specific area near the Duomo or via Monte Napoleone and etc. They by no means will be sufficient to feed Milan. So we continue with the project and we started to think, are there other resources in the city that we can work with? And is there a way of remetabolizing what exists in the urban fabric? There are bacteria, there are microalgae that exist in city. What if we can start to look at these microorganisms that are present in city and we start to devise a way of working with them? So we went back to our idea of our interface and we started to instead develop a series of experiments in which we engage the public in mapping the presence of this microorganism, and we discovered that in the canal that were built by Leonardo, actually there was a blooming on specific type of microalgae. We start to map them, map what are their nutrients, that actually they eat pollution and etc. But then we focus specifically on spatially articulating how algae farming, basically articulating the relationship between the algae farming and the users. And before Martin referred to God and referred to the fact that the Incan, if they would take a piece of mineral from the mountain, they would ask the permission of the mountain. So if we refer to Bateson, my favorite sentence on Bateson that says that pure rational language without the help of religion, poetry, and the like is not capable of realizing meaning, but is actually poisoning of life. So I don't actually attempt to go into God with my installation. I'm also Italian, would be a little bit conflictual for me, but maybe through aesthetic, material articulation, poetry, we could reestablish a different relationship between local production, untapped resources, and the user. And I'm not saying that to say that the prototype we do are beautiful, but we've been criticized sometimes for them being over-aestheticized and actually less efficient than real algae farming. And yeah, that's actually maybe true, but that's what we are interested in. That's why we work on them, because we believe aesthetic and possibly poetry or have a power of communication with the end user that could change the way we create a relationship with bacteria, microalgae, and production. In this particular installation that was actually upstairs in the front member room, if I remember the name of the room correctly, is the front one, right? So we were investigating 5 types of different microalgae, and we were looking in how they would grow by the environmental condition in which they were embedded, so the solar radiation, the user, and how by growing they will also create this gradient of color. So we were asking people to effectively cultivate the algae by providing CO2 to them. That's me. The other had straw, but I would just blow directly and providing CO2 to the microalgae. But at the same time, by providing CO2, you create this sort of one-to-one relationship with the bubbling and the oxygen that gets released that for us is an important component of the prototype that we built. And then we augmented them because we always have the component, we call it the biodigital component with a fancy name, but we always have this component of the physical reality and the augmented one, so that we could establish multiple relationships with the prototype itself and with the production. So we had this QR code, and by scanning them, you could go in the microscopic image of the specific algae, so create a different type of relationship with it and become a sort of cyber gardener, but also get a recipe of what you can actually do with the specific type of microalgae. Maybe you can produce food, maybe energy, maybe something else. So, and then we went on, we built other type of prototype that would articulate column and ceilings. And again, we were interested on how you establish this type of communication with the prototype. This one was in particularly focusing on the idea of harvesting. So from simply interactive and cultivating to the fact that you could passively harvest, in this case, chlorella and spirulina. Well, that's my daughter. So, and from this type of prototype, we kept evolving, and we arrived to one of the latest one, which is the urban algae folly. The urban algae folly is conceived as a prototype for the public realm, and at the moment, actually, until yesterday, was exhibited in Expo Milan 2015. It redescribes the idea of a canopy, but is as well a productive canopy. It becomes a sort of event of production in the city. And I brought Marco here. This is the video we did with Expo that described the canopy.
My name is Marco Poletto from Ecologic Studio in London. We are artists and architects, and we are here in Expo presenting the urban algae folly. The urban algae folly is an interactive pavilion for the urban cultivation of spirulina. It's a built demonstration of architecture's biodigital future. Aspects of our project is to bring the cultivation of microalgae within the urban environment. This is a public space where the folly operates at different levels. On one side, it creates a particular condition for visitors to rest, to be shaded by the algae, by the canopy and the microalgae themselves, and also to find the refreshment in the evaporative cooling of the pavilion.
The urban algae folly produces an average of 2 kilograms of oxygen per day, which is the equivalent oxygen that 3 adults need to survive. It takes 25 large urban trees to do that. The folly produces the equivalent in proteins of 2 kilograms of meat per day. The folly also captures CO2 at a rate of 4 kg per day. All this is happening in the public realm. This is the key idea of the project, embed production in the urban realm.
Algae really challenge us to understand nature really as part of an infrastructure, what we call a biodigital infrastructure of the city. Our vision is that the convergence of information and biological technologies can create a possibility for a new industrial revolution, for the creation of a new city, of a new urban environment.
So, in particular, this prototype will dealing with the cultivation of spirulina was in Expo in the area of the Future Food District. And we had a series of events that were also asked by the client, in which these are some of the data, but you heard already some of them. So, but we had a series of events in which we try to understand how we can evolve the way not only we understand spatial organization, but also we understand food. We work with a local chef, and it was a very simple experiment, but I think was quite interesting in a way, because it looked like that something that is happening in the architectural world is happening also in other fields. Like, for example, there is a lot of spirulina or chlorella that are present in many of the food that we consume, but they never have the dignity of food. They are always a medicine. And the first prototype that we presented in Milan, a lot of Milanese ladies would come to me and say, oh, but look, really eating algae, do we really need to do that? Well, I can get it as a pill, but you know. And I would always answer that if you think about biting many of the food that we eat nowadays without a culinary culture behind, there is a lot of process that go in the food, from what we actually eat, from what we eat and what it was before, that it's necessary that we shift. We develop new type of culture of interacting with what actually exists in the city. So, well, these were very simple experiment in this sense. And this is how the canopy was until yesterday. Now he's moving somewhere else. He's going to Portugal. Well, he's getting also reformatted in the meantime, and that will be a little bit even more of an experiment, because we will be in a real public space. So we will see how eventually we will organize the interaction of the user with that. So the last project that I would like to present is the Metafolly for the Metropolitan Garden. The Metafolly gets the name from, again, the book of Bateson that I mentioned before, Steps Toward an Ecology of Life. It's a sort of attempt of creating a meta space. Again, dealing with the relationship between nuances of behavior that in this case are not, and material, which in this case are not organic, but they are organically inspired. So we looked to design a Metafolly, we looked into a set of biomimetic principles, like cricket in this case, how they create material sounds. And we try to investigate how, by recycling material like the piezo buzzer that you find in the birthday card and etc., we could create a sort of sonic environment that could interact with the user. So these are some of the tiles and how they modulate the sound. And this is some of the material articulation. Again, for us, fluxes of information, in this case are more fluxes of information, of bits, are always as well material articulation. They are never real information on their own. They are also morphology. For us, doesn't exist productivity, energy, information without the morphology itself. So they are all interwoven one with the other. So the way we work with material and information is to combine them. So this was one of the three sort of brain of the Folly that had an algorithm that was simulate this cricket that would escape for you, but in reality would just send a set of electric input, a very low current that would activate this piezo buzzer. and create an interaction with the user, but at the same time will be part of the structural morphology of the folly itself. And these are the hubs. And the material articulation will be at the same time material, but also studying moire effect of sound that interact with the user. These are some of the view of the folly. And here we have the sound. So the sound is not a register sound, but is a material sound created by these tiles and this recycled electronic chip. So the idea is again to look at untapped resources in the city, but this time rather than being bacteria, are pieces of electronic that are part of birthday card. And what do you do with them after you got the birthday? So I'll conclude with a question. Can the convergence of information and biological technologies conjures the possibility of a new industrial revolution that is harvesting the potential of emergent collective intelligence in breeding future biocities? That's it.
Thanks, Claudia, very much for the talk. I'd now like to, perhaps, if you can lift the screen, I'd like to invite all the speakers to join us at the table for discussion, where we can also have a Q&A session with the audience.
One of the microphones. Okay. Hopefully they lift it and they don't drop it down.
You guys must be so busy.
Yeah, this period, yes.
This is your new installation just gone up.
We have a new exhibition, new installation, there are new manga and stuff.
Right.
And then we have a new algae folly in Portugal, and we are redoing the old structure, and it's going up by the 10th of November. So,
And yes, I won't ask you how you do it. Yeah.
and so until the 15th year, like,
Just, yeah, you know,
yeah, because for two things like that, for us,
yeah, that is intense.
So, first of all, thanks the speakers for their very, very exciting talk. And I'm sure we have enough material to discuss for the rest of the afternoon, not just between us, but also with the audience. I think it's interesting in every talk, there was something quite compelling about not just the thematic, but I think the approach that you have for the thematic in relation to not just architecture, but where is the human capacity, to what extent the human figure is part of the process, to what extent or to what what's the role? Because it seems constantly that one talks about the Anthropocene, it tends to see that the magnitude, it gets bigger and bigger. So it seems to be that every time that one talks about the Anthropocene, we end up in a space in terms of the space that is almost like the whole planet Earth. But at the same time, I think all the speakers today, in different ways, talked about the human scale, about the human figure, and even the idea of very intense and intrinsic relationships between the anthropos and the centrism, as Mark was saying. So perhaps just a question to kick off the discussion is a question that is perhaps dumb, but at the same time has it has some validity for us to start a discussion. Where is thank you.
That was the moment we were waiting for.
I actually asked for it.
Let me repeat the question.
Sorry.
So it's almost like the basic part of the question is that the role of people within the systems or between the architecture or between the role of architecture, and maybe should we be talking also about the scale of people? Should the scale of how architecture is thinking the user or people or the congregation of humans, let's put it like this.
I'll have a go at starting. I think one of the wonderful things about being human is ethics. And one of the problems that I've had with discourses with biomimicry is that the ethics is either absent or assumed. If it's assumed, it's going to be natural selection. And we saw that quite a lot in the 20th century, not with very positive results. So in some ways, I mean, I would, whilst criticizing and critiquing the Anthropocene, I don't want to, let's just say, talk humans down. I think that for a productive and enriching third millennium, I think that the presence of humans is necessary. For the entire, I don't mean just from an anthropocentric perspective. I actually think from a biospherical perspective. In terms, I get what you're saying. But I think from a biospherical perspective, actually the world is better with us. However, I think that we need to be conscious about the ethics, and I think that's what's very, particularly when you're talking about, the secular, really kind of figuring, what are we about? What is community? I mean, is it just people? Are we just building architectures for people? In an age when we understand that 90% of our cells are actually bacterial, who and what are we designing for? And I think that running through, I think all of the talks today is a questioning of the ethics of the production of space.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we are so interested, almost obsessed, with material system is that we have the impression that architecture or the built environment has lost somehow sensitivity towards differentiation or what is present in the ground. Because if we would harvest both what bacteria and people have to say, but not necessarily to say, but to interact, to do, I think we could change. We could have different dynamic. We can introduce different dynamic in the system. I think at the moment, the way we conceive the built environment is not sensible, is not sensitive enough to actually harvest this power of the end user, that can be the single end user or a group of end user or the bacteria on his skin, or, but we always build for macro category, very generic one. We tend to build in that manner. And so in that way, we are not open, the buildings are not sensible enough to change and harvest this type of, not only saying, because I don't think it's a question of logically saying, but it's a question of more gardening. Can we have more gardener in the city rather than a single a single or 10 voice, but can we have millions of voices? And then, maybe I still don't know. I don't have a clear simulation of where that will go, but maybe we can trigger a different level of sort of self-organization or different dynamic in the system.
All right. Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I really love these talks today. They're very provocative, and I think we all sort of, there's a weird centrifugal thing going on here, right? And the genius of you guys maybe have picked us from arbitrary places to sort of produce this effect. I don't know. I would say perhaps I'm a material theist. I'm just not a scientist. I mean, I respect everything scientists do. I mean, that's not the issue. I mean, so it's not a anti-scientist position. But I'm sort of interested in the problem of material theism, largely because it's how humans operated for 1 million+ years, right? And then in some sense we stripped ourselves bare of all of that language and so forth like that. And it haunts us still. I think in other words, my point was that there's a sort of a self-flagellational capacity of civilization which sort of is still trying to purge itself from all of this, calling it superstition or whatever you want to call it, right? So I'm interested in having a dialogue with microbes. I think that is sort of so important, precisely to get out of the human scaleness, which came in the Renaissance or whenever it came in, the Greeks or whatever you want to call them, that sort of screwed things up in a way, right? Because it meant everything had to be this, like this. When in reality, if you're a material theist, you can operate it at any scale in a way, right? Because you don't know what the scale of the voice, right? It could be very small, a microbe. It could be an animal. It could be the scale of wind. It could be the scale of a mountain. And then you sort of can start at whatever scale you might want, and then you have these conversations and you work with them, right? I mean, I have no idea. I tried to sort of suggest a reasonable type of architecture that comes out of that without getting too weird about it, But I do think, we've rediscovered, in some sense, the microbial scale. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, I think it's not just because we have computers and microscopes. I mean, we've had microscopes for a long time, but now we're slowly relaxing from the compulsion to see that as just as just a little thing that becomes a big thing that becomes a big thing, right? Some sort of organic thing, right? And now we're discovering that there is an inner thing, something going on in there, right? Which needs to be sort of unpacked in a particular way.
Can I add something as well, which is I think that engaging with these multi-scalar systems, perspectives across different species, ecologies, and material agents is not to deproblematize the world. I don't think this is a utopia. I think I quite like Bruno Latour's notion that we've never been modern, and then there's this whole categorization of things that throw up hybrids that we kind of ignore, and then they become problems for us, and then they kind of bite us and throw up more categorization. But essentially, Haraway talks about this quite beautifully, which is about contested boundaries, staying with the trouble. That when you have many agents and many bodies in space, there are contested boundaries, and that there are overlapping interests and concerns. And I think that there's actually a global scale context for thinking about this, which is a kind of eco-politics. And the way I might describe it is I went to Korea earlier in the year and looked at the demilitarized zone and how the ecosystem, the 4-kilometer strip between the two countries at war, actively at war, somehow or other have created this bizarre tourist spectacle of war that we all get in a bus for, kind of look at all the wildlife, people with guns, pointing at each other across turrets, and yet the kind of the buffer zone is creating a space in which contested territory invites like other voices, sometimes non-human, sometimes global voices. And another one was when I went to Ukraine, there was the invasion of the East by Russian military forces. And the city we were critiquing were projects for Mariupol, and the question was, how do we start to construct architectures for a city that is, in a direct line for invasion? And one of the questions we came up with was, do we actually just produce a set aside of land, a buffer zone, not just between Ukraine and Russia invasive forces, but actually also between the slag coming out of the abandoned factories and the sea level rises. So I'm not quite sure what it means, but I think that there is a kind of politics of contestation that's implicit in this. This is not a happy ending, it's an ongoing struggle. We're going to get some things right, we're going to get some things wrong, and that's why I think that the kind of ethics, the kind of engaging with the unknown, even though we it may be bigger than us and more powerful than us. I think that there's a certain courage that's required to design and think and engineer in these spaces, because they're not what we know.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
It's interesting that this morning we were just discussing at the unit, and I think this question was posed based on the presentations, but also in having the chance to travel and lecture and present work around. It's interesting how there is a differentiation between the fields of architecture. Why in one way you have poles of some kind of development, in others perhaps, I'm not talking developing world or even within countries, within cities, you have a different approach to look at architecture that sometimes tend to generate some level of purgeness or alienation or categorization, right, between types of architectures, let's say from the digital to biomorphology to even kind of what is a vernacular or what is a certain context reading. And so I think it's interesting when you mentioned these different sites, because I think it brings forward the question of this threshold of participation, perhaps not as let's everyone now come here and build, but what is that level of engagement and arbitration, which Latour also talks about it somehow, that is necessary. So, and I think it's interesting, while these architectures might not be necessarily a top-down or bottom-up, whatever analogy we're able to do, they certainly need to be claiming why we're going to be doing that, not just for between ourselves, but also which kind of specific, let's say, should I call it audience, should I call it community, should I call it country, should I call it village, or should I call it forest? It's kind of an interesting question.
But I think this connects quite a lot with your question before, no? Sometimes we say that we are interested in pre-industrial community as well as natural model. And if you look at pre-industrial community, there is a question that is the material practice, that is both something that is define the relationship between the single being and the built environment, but also the relationship between single beings. At the moment, it looks to me that, with the Industrial Revolution and the segregation of skills, not only the built environment got objectified, but even our profession got objectified. So our profession, we are not defined through our material practice of a single being, which is specifically me, Claudia Pasquero of Ecologic Studio. It cannot be anybody else. It's a specific mix of a certain type of material practice. But we are defined through general category, the same way we define buildings. So I think similar. There might be differences. I'm not a theorist by no means, but for me it's a similar way. There is a similar sort of problem or issue that I don't feel comfortable with, which is this forma mentis that segregate in sort of medium-sized category, not too large, not too big, like polite category, but don't allow for deeper level of engagement, or what I call material practice. Know-how, which is not necessarily a logical know-how or an etiquette, but is a different kind of know-how, which is very specific of a certain moment in time and of a certain sort of relationship that you establish, both with your design, that with the space, that with the other in the profession. Yeah.
yeah, I'm also thinking we live in a suburb of Boston, Cambridge. I mean Belmont, not too far from Cambridge, and over the years, and just on a little bitty plot of land, I began to sort of look at all the animals that live on our plot with us, right? The squirrels, the physical animals that I can. There are 3 skunks and about 10 cats that come through. I mean, and various dogs, and I mean, not to mention ants and God knows what, and things you don't see, right? And it's truly astonishing how we live with other creatures, but we completely refuse to, have any sensibility about that in our architectural profession. I don't know how to do it, but we have a barn in the back, and it was infested, with squirrels, and I didn't want them chewing up my books. So I had, how do you get the squirrels out, but living in the barn without them chewing my things? Right? So I hired a carpenter who made a little squirrel thing for the squirrels, right? And then there's a steel plate. They're on the outside, I'm on the inside. And the human does have its own rights too. I mean, okay, I'm not, saying we don't, but how do we manage this coexistence? And it really is sort of fascinating. And then there's this person, is this somewhere in Florida, who also lives in a small yard, and grew it natural, and actually got a variance from the city to say that his land or her land, whoever owns it, is considered officially wild, right? And so there's a fence, and it says, you can't walk to my front door, right? Because you're walking through wild property. So you have to ring the bell, right? And I'm going to sort of come out because we don't want you wandering around, and God knows what's in there, right? It could be stakes, whatever it is, right? But it's the most bizarrest and most fantastically brilliant thing. Here you are in the suburb, right? And then there's this house which is invisible behind this riot of stuff, right? You just let it grow, and that's what happens, right? And the house is still there, beautiful. It's all painted blue and red. I mean, it's gorgeous, right? And it's not like it's become shackified or falling apart, right? I mean, but there's this strange realm of wild, which is about 10 or 12 feet around this house, right? And that's a type of interesting courage, that provokes a certain something that I think we don't have, right? I mean, all architecture will make a building, and then there'll be the whitescape around it, which will be for arbitrary landscape artists to make a plant, and we have sort of don't talk anymore, if you will, about these strange encounters with our fellow inhabitants on the earth, and that's what I'm getting at. So.
Okay, and Mark, you mentioned also the idea of hunter and gatherers and the problematics that you had with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also a bit of the introduction. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's part of the introduction of your book, Architecture for Societies. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because perhaps there is a connection or not with what Rachel was saying on her talk about there is not necessarily creating a new revolution, that something is ending and something new is beginning, but there is perhaps, you use the word navigate, navigate between these streams. So I wonder if there is a relationship there.
I think there is. That was what's so appealing about your work. I would probably, admittedly, be, in other words, I would say the intellectual fight might be harder than the scientific one. I mean, if I can, I'm not saying that your struggle isn't in any way easy. I want to give a little notch, for the intellectual problematic, because we have so naturalized our anthropocentric point of view that we don't see it or hear it anymore. In other words, that's the example of the hunter-gatherer. The Cambridge Encyclopedia comes out, and these guys are sitting in Cambridge, not too far from here, and they think they're really smart, and they're doing all this good stuff, and they're going to give us this catalog of who these people are, right? But it's such extreme arrogance to think of this. And if we want to learn something from our predecessors who are all in our DNA. I mean, we that's the irony of it all, right? Each and every one of us in this room, you know, has something left of haplogen group A, you know, I mean, you know, there are only like 100 of these people left, and our generation, you know, my generation is responsible for the final extermination of our predecessors who've lived for 1 million years without agriculture. I mean, what kind of a terrible thought that is, right? You know, I mean, your generation, you won't even know what it's like anymore. I mean, because these people already have been removed finally after maybe 5,000 years of violent struggle against these types, you know. So, I mean, and you know, and this sort of mass silent eradication, and it lurks within us. The main point was, you know, this schizophrenic moment is sort of these eruptional moments, and the one book I think should be required to every architect to read is Julian Jaynes' The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, and that book I think just absolutely brilliantly sort of explains the paradox of a way of thinking that we can sort of get to and understand, but without ever actually being that, because we're not going to go back, you know, in a real way. But we have to be able to expand our narrative project to include this without first abstracting them into some sort of low lives, right? Right. In fact, it's sort of like the opposite, you know. I mean, we're our arrogance, right, that does not appeal well, I think, you know, in an inverted way.
I think one of the interesting things that Latour did in his Gifford lectures was to introduce that notion of the earthbound. In other words, dumping the idea of human. I think Steve Fuller would say that, you know, we haven't ascertained what human 1.0 is, let alone human 2.0, post-human or transhuman is. And so Latour's going to move to creating this category, which I think some people are saying is a kind of post-human, is earthbound. And I really like the feel of it, because one of the projects that you know, I'm working on at the moment is called Persephone, which is a laboratory which is set in a starship, and I'm inviting designers to think about what a world would be like if we constructed it from its soils, including, you know, the identities and the beings that would be inside these spaces.
There's this sci-fi movie. Is this piece of a forest? It's the last piece of the rainforest. Did you know this movie?
No, I don't.
Oh, it's a B movie.
Okay.
You know, it's really okay. I love it.
Sounds like my thing.
Yes, exactly what they. And it's the last rainforest, bit of the rainforest. They carved it out and put it on a big spaceship and put it up into space. And there are 5 scientists up there who tend it and make sure it works and all that type of stuff, right? And what happens? What happens? It all goes terribly wrong because some nasty guy. There's an animal in there with some fur or something like that.
Is it Trumbull's Silent Running or something? Is it? No. Okay, no.
I don't know. Oh, it all goes terribly wrong, and at the end, of course, there's a big explosion, and then the last forest that's gone, right? You know, it's just because some stupid nut, you know, wants to do something or other, you know, I'll find it and I'll email it to you. It's hilarious. I mean, but very poignant. But it's about 10 years old now. Yeah.
I mean, but the reason for mentioning the starship again is to just simply about to articulate relationships without these, as you know, as you pointed out, these historical precedents in which we prejudice ourselves against or kind of separate ourselves from other beings. And one of the most beautiful but craziest pieces of text I've read in a science book is by, and I mean crazy in a very enthusiastic way, is Michael Mortner, who's a chemist. And he wrote a book about directed panspermia. And at the beginning of this book, which is really about a very scientific, analytic look at what kinds of soils and creatures can live on meteorites and how they might spread across the universe, is this manifesto for life. And very much unlike the Linnaean categorization by separation, tree, he's kind of saying that there is a community of life in which if we are going to, so he defines the mission for humanity as spreading life around the universe, but any kind of life. Doesn't rather superficial in the ethics, which is like life is good and no life is bad. That's about as far as the ethical analysis goes. But what's kind of interesting is that there is this horizontal kinship that kind of comes out of this perspective. And it's really, for me, a laboratory for re-articulating some of these relationships. It takes it beyond the blue sky thinking and, if we were going to settle Mars, what have we got in the bag that might be useful? And, can we invent a few robots that are going to help us on the way? Into another dimension which hasn't yet happened, and it kind of invites us to think about, who we are again for a third millennium. But it's really more of a conceptual space. But some of the work that and questions that have been raised, kind of fold back into that.
Well, and just perhaps, once again, because I'm sort of the weird, bibliophile here, this is the problem. I mean, I hate to say this, with the Wikipedia issue, right? Because once again, it falls into the trap of just basically subsuming all of the bad, lingo that's sort of out there, right? So in other words, if you talk, Homo sapiens, right? I mean, this word should be completely banned, and everyone in Homo sapiens should be made perfectly clear that they should be embarrassed even to think along these lines. But you wouldn't find that in sort of this, once again, in a type of, people, and you look up the word hunter-gatherer, and it doesn't say, warning, do not use this is really bad, and it'll connect you to even worse words like foragers, which is even morally, insanely, obtruse. And so there's no, anywhere in there, right, any kind of awareness of type of, critical project, right? Which I think gets right down to all of the projects that you're working on, right? All of the intellectual questions that I think are going to be impinged on architecture today to think differently, but won't be if we continuously refer to these types of nonsenses.
Yes.
Right. We have to have a whole new lexicon in a way, right, and a whole new mindset, right? I feel architecture schools are just, becoming increasingly obsolete if they don't make profound changes in their pedagogy. I mean, it just, it's just like, well, I mean, architecture schools like today, like, I'm sorry, I feel like we're in the 19th century. It's all everybody imitates very academic. I mean, from the forest to the academe, right? Is exactly, almost that was a cannily beautiful, right? Everything's, so we need to sort of break it all apart, start with new pieces, start new experiments, and go from there.
Yeah, I agree that language is really important. How you actually describe things in relation to other things, it really changes everything.
Yeah, it changes.
There is this Italian historian, now I don't remember the name, that I was reading one day on the relationship between us and other ecological systems that was quite interesting because it was redescribing our relationship and the relationship between different groups of human being and animal and human being and insect potentially in terms of empathy. So in particular that chapter was talking about vegetarian, but was talking about the fact that in the Colosseum, at the time of the Colosseum, the social system was developed as such that the people inside of the Colosseum wouldn't be people. They were not humanity. They were other being. They were something else from what they are. But in the current society, maybe through empathy, we could start to recognize humanity somewhere else than in humanity, and therefore start to trace other link. But then there I go back to my practice usually, because I believe that without the practice you cannot experience humanity if you are segregated in system and the abstraction of academia and etc.
I think what unfortunately Mike couldn't be here for the discussion anymore, but I think what he tried to say as well, and what we are partly discussing now, is that we should not just at buildings and architecture, and within, like, amongst the architects, but also speak to non-architects, which is a little bit also what we are saying now, that we need to cross the borders or spread architecture into other fields. And I mean, you are doing this with biology and chemistry, so I think that is, at the moment, nowadays for architecture, super fascinating and interesting to utilize other knowledge from other fields. So it's not just the language or the communication between human to human, and of course understanding other societies, other cultures, but also between architect and non-architect.
I think one of the great, most beautiful things about architecture is the visionary capacity, you know, which really doesn't exist, you know, from my experience, you know, so richly within other disciplines. I mean, you know, you have, you know, people that write great literature, you have people that make great paintings, but I think that there's a synthetic capacity within architecture that is really quite extraordinary, and I really don't think that architecture is working that potential for radical change, and we so desperately need that. You know, it's been subsumed within an industrial system because of a certain kind of economics and a certain kind of social conformity, you know, on which, you know, architecture as an industry has done very well. But I really think that we're at a point where, you know, science and technology has been given the crown for innovation. But I think that we're, with this kind of overlapping of paradigms, there really is the potential for design thinking to come through, not to provide answers, which is where science and technology kind of draw their finishing point. You know, they kind of say, okay, right, now we got one of these, we're done, and they walk away from it. Whereas design thinking really keeps asking better questions. You know, you ask one set of questions, it opens up another set, you ask another set. I mean, so, you know, the things that Claudia describing, you know, she's asking better and better and better questions of the spaces that she's practicing in. And it's an ongoing thing. We know, rather than this 3 to 5 years, let's produce a product, and if we can't produce a product within 5 years, it's an viable proposition. So I mean, I think that architecture has a visionary capacity. It has a multidisciplinarity within it. And I think that this is the age of design thinking, where the big why, and, you know, which part of the elephant are we holding, and what does that mean, is going to be absolutely essential to third millennial innovation. And I really think that that opportunity is there. And I think that, you know, this generation of young architects is really poised to make a huge difference to you know, our the quality of space that we inhabit, and the, you know, the capacity for cities to be humane.
And I think they can do that only if they tackle more articulated and maybe complex and maybe fuzzy and unclear question that, just as Rachel mentioned, provide vision. If we kind of corner ourselves, and I think this is really a problem for architecture at the moment. It's a very critical problem, both in the practice, but also in the academia. It's like the specialization. I mean, sciences can be specialized somehow. Maybe they will evolve as well in a different manner culturally, but, you know, if you need to produce discover this type of water that does this and that and doesn't have this mineral, you do that, okay? You have a clear research question, right? If a designer close themselves in the same type of question, they're always going to be secondary to science. There is no way, you know? We are not scientists. We can't do that. So, and on the other hand, they don't bring what they could bring, which is something else. Maybe it's not so easy to close in a very sharp initial question, but it's an ongoing sort of gardening the right question to come out, to provide a vision of how this bottle can become something else and can create trace a relationship with other 5 disciplines and have an impact on the city where we live. It might seem banal, and it might seem what architecture is, but I think in this moment in our culture is really something that is problematic in the discipline, because we've been somehow forced to follow a method which I don't think is kind of embedded in design. It's a method that is part of other discipline that act in a different manner and they have different framework. And so we should try to unpack that and actually propose other method and stand for them. If not, we will just be second and beautify a little bit the bottle. But that's not what we want to do, maybe.
And I think the opportunity is the nature of the third millennial question. The nature of the third millennial question is that hyper-complex question that isn't easily soluble or meaningful to reduce down into little components. I mean, I think that is the opportunity when you can't just put a full stop at the end of it and go, well, that's it, we've sorted the city. Or climate change, you
the
know.
computational city or the critical city? Which one of the two you want to solve? Because
We see that's a designer's response because, you know, I've seen plenty of industrialists and, you know, that have said, we now have smart cities, we don't need to worry about cities again because they're now efficient. Job done.
You know, which in a way goes back to that idea of how when Cedric Price asked about technology is the answer, but what's the question? I mean, what's the extent of the problematics that we want to involve? Perhaps other disciplines is part of the discussion, but also other sensibilities. Once you read all of Stapleton, there's no way to ever come back because there is a writer that in 200 pages can unpack 200 million years of imagination. And also when you study the history of ancient civilizations, or precisely the key question in South America, in the Amazon, you start kind of going towards very unanswerable questions, but also very interesting traces of radical different ways of living that is not just based on the future, but also based in a radical reinterpretation of the past, which is, I think is a very, very interesting discussion. But I also like to, perhaps we could open a little bit to the floor, and if there is any question to the speakers or anyone is completely lost and would like to a bit of enlightenment from our guests, please.
we lost them very often.
Questions? Yes.
It's more addressed to. Does it work? Okay. It's more addressed to the girls, and their urban proposal, because I find kind of analogies between you, and you're kind of proposing a city which is not like kind of biomimetic, but more like bio-derived. So it's something that we can control, but we can just kind of let's say imagine through a computational and scientific method. And I find a lot of analogies as well with parametricism, but my question is, it's a bit more strong in this case, because while in parametricism we are talking about kind of architectural virtuosism or formalism, in this case you're proposing a city which is kind of needed. Like it seems that you think that your proposal would actually save us from the end. And so how do you think to address the problem of identity? Because since the man was born, we used to build huts, and huts are not made of, have no like kind of organic shapes, but they are already like they represent us. They are represent how we shape shapes also according to what we think of sacredness and stuff. So what do you think of identity when you think of computational design into bio-derived urban morphologies?
So, well, you're talking
Sounds
about...
like a question to the boys as well.
You're talking...
Anyway.
You're talking about identity or iconicity is a different question. And because it looks you're talking more about iconicity rather than identity in a way. But I'm not, well, although I'm interested in certain type of morphology, I'm not particularly like a founder of a morphology rather than another one. I'm interested on triggering practice, as I said before, and then I work with certain specific morphology which I believe can articulate flow or that can create a dialogue with science or other discipline in that way. But in relationship to the art, I have a sort of, there is something that I've been thinking for a while, and also when I was younger. I don't have a clear theory on that, but I believe that, you know, what we build around ourselves is not necessarily a art, but is a set of relationship, and we are built in relationship with the surrounding environment. So when the art came out, and in the Renaissance, when the perspective view came out, you might consider that system, like the biospheric system, were quite strong, but also other social systems like invasion and etc. There were certain type of forces that architecture had to sort of incorporate or react to, or sometimes oppose strongly, which had a different strength from the forces we are dealing with nowadays. You know, there are a lot of studies of environmental psychology that argue that there are a certain part of our brain that when deal with pattern is able to release the stress. And if we don't get this, we get sort of schizophrenic or something like that. So there are studies on the relationship between human and pattern, and human and system, and human and dynamic. And for me, the envelope that we define, while for a while was an envelope that sort of protected us from this dynamic, I think now we are overprotected. I mean, my kind of perception or sensibility, I don't have any theory about that, it's just a design sensibility, tells me that we are kind of overprotected. We are surrounded by not one art, but thousands of art, you know? And so then I locate myself as a designer on the position of deconstructing that art and establishing new relationship with the system that surround me, with the flow of energy, with the wind, with the growth, because we are not able anymore to perceive this type of flow. We are not able to create a material relationship with them, while before probably we were overwhelmed by them. I can imagine. Well, that's, as I said, I don't have a strong academic research on that, but that's my design sensibility tells me that we need a shift. That's also why tools shift, and that's why I believe we invent new techniques. The perspective view, I'm not against, but was invented in a totally socio-economical, environmental context, you know? And I think it was good for the time, you know? It was framing the environment, trying to frame this overwhelming sort of biosphere, nature surrounding us. But now we need something else. We need to create, actually augment the sensitivity. We need to create different type of relationship with that. That's why I don't completely agree with the parametricist idea that try to reduce everything in style and morphology. I think that is killing the process, is killing the interest, is deviating from what is actually interesting in all of that. Is putting an accent on what is the least interesting, okay? I'm interested in morphology and the aesthetic that come out and the potential communication of that, but I'm interested in them because I think they can create a shift from the art that we were designing, the technique that we have, to technique that are more embedded in a specific context and in a specific moment in time. For me, they look more embedded. And that's why I work as I work and I propose what I propose, basically.
I would never describe identity as a problem. I like to think of it as being something incredibly fluid, and I think what's been the problem is that we have fixed identity as an expectation. And for me, that is more problematic than feeling that actually, who I am and how I express myself, what ethics and values I embrace, have a potential to shift in relationship to other things happening around me. And the way that I try to choreograph those relationships, for me, needs to be fluid, because otherwise I do become ghettoized, labeled, marginalized. I would not imagine myself as being part of the hoi polloi. So I think that kind of engaging with an emerging politics of kind of ecological relationships, kind of shifting biological dynamics. When the human genome, when it was formally sequenced in 2003, contained 1/3 of the expected number of genes. Rather than being the solution to all future medicine, all of a sudden it became a problem of an unfathomably, huge nature, which was one gene is now doing 3 jobs on average. So what does that tell us about genes? It totally, threw a completely different lens on what we thought we'd been doing up until that point. And so I think the fluidity of identity is actually a third millennial approach. I mean, perhaps it wasn't in the second millennium, but I think that is actually part of the essence. It's what we expect on the internet now. I mean, now I could articulate myself as being one person at home and another person in the street, and maybe somebody else when I'm in a classroom. And nobody, kind of says, "Oh, you need to go to the psychiatrist." 20 years ago, they might have. Before the internet, they may well have. "Oh, you're not the same person all day long." And to suggest that now to digital natives, it's kind of a bonkers idea that they are the same all the time. But yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really good question that you're raising, and I think that the answer is actually the landscape and this kind of stratification of many different possibilities is actually part of the opportunity and actually part of the challenge that we're facing, and how we navigate and orient through that.
Perhaps just one little paragraph here. I think architecture when a stint as a dean at MIT, I was just brilliantly focused on, not me, but I was put into a sort of a brilliantly strange environment where sciences have been just like, their brains are going, right? And the chair of the biology department is saying, we need a bioengineering department, right? And so and then the bioengineering guy said, "Oh my God, we have to get a biochemical engineer," right? And so they're concocting these new disciplines, right, to match in some sense the real life research protocols, basically from a younger generation. I mean, from the likes of you guys, right? And whereas the old fogies, right, they want their biology department, damn it, And so the question is, when incoming students, now do we teach them the old way? There's biology, and here's a frog, and you cut up the frog, right? Or do we just sort of put them right into sort of the new bioengineering, computational, data stream, genetical, right? Of course. And the young people say that's how you got to go. That's the future. The old guys say, well, we have to teach them basic science, right? God, these are fascinating. We're talking, there's millions of dollars are at stake here, right? Because of funding streams and whatever. And this isn't just some sort of arbitrary conversation. And, it was just like, wow, this is so cool, right? Now, you go into our field, and, it's like, okay, column's a little crooked. Okay, that's cute, Or there's the surface, okay. That's not, it's just so like, whoa, we are so not in the discussion. And, I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm just sort of saying it's clear that we weren't, right? And I'm not just saying MIT, but I think, most schools of architecture are 90% sort of not in the discussion. And, we have to sort of ask ourselves what that discussion actually is ultimately, right? And how we're going to change and rethink, because the old school methods have worked so long, and this is all slowly falling apart. But we don't really know. And the problem with anthropocentrism, I was trying to argue, is that it's all built around a pathology of staticness. that somehow man is known, man and woman, whatever, capital M, and that the Holocene exists, and Holocene was a static thing, that's once again, it was never static, it went up and down all over the time, right? And then there's big shock. Oh my God, there's a global warming period, in 6,000, BC that produces the Sahara Desert. Oh really? Oh yeah. There's a global warming period in the 9th century AD, right? That had a huge impact on this. There was a little ice age, right? With Holland freezing over, in the 17th century. It was always up and down, right? But because we insist on static nation states, on static cities, on private and public, all of these concepts that are produced during the sort of the civilizational Holocenic worldview, right? Are being just pushed, by the bulldozers overboard, right? And we're discovering that things are dynamic, things are changing, things are fluid, the disciplines have to change, whatever, right? It's scary, right? And we have Syrians on the doorstep. All of a sudden, it's like the world is back to where it wants to be, in a way, right? Which is sort of a little crazy, compared to the mind that's always trying to rationalize everything, And, I think it's a time to embrace that a little bit, as opposed to putting up certain types of barriers. I don't know where this is going. I'm sorry. Okay, my rant is over.
Yes, just a second.
It was beautiful.
It's not really a question, more of a comment. You began your historic perspective with the Enlightenment, and of course cathedrals were built entirely without architects, and that in societies where they built in vernacular materials, they didn't use architects. And I think it's in a way we're returning to a time with that kind of openness. And you talked, Claudia, about the post-segregated skills. And in those much earlier societies, the skills were much more integrated. And so I think it's an exciting time. Like after the fall of the Rome, the Dark Ages were very interesting. And had we still got the Roman numerical system, we would not be able to have computers. Things have to change. So there's a great, I also get very excited by the longer perspective in the same way as if you look at what the Hubble telescope sees, it's terribly comforting. You get the same patterns and images through the microscope and the telescope. That's got to be helpful, whether it's God silent or speaking or not. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll shut up, is when I was 18, I spent a year in Papua New Guinea. And the most interesting person and most intelligent person I think I ever met in my life was a deaf and dumb New Guinean ship's captain who ran a little copra ship with a staff. And in a funny kind of way, having no language enabled him to negotiate both cultures. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Beautiful.
Well, I think what you said about the cathedral connects a little bit with what Mario Karpov brought in the algorithm and the alphabet, no? The idea that computation has brought a revolution, but which kind of revolution is not the idea that we have superpower computer that is changing what we can do, but is the idea that we somehow redescribe what the architect is, and maybe we go back to the type of period where the architect, it was not called architect, but was still there. There was a master builder. There was a person that had in mind what was going on, but he wouldn't make a precise geometrical drawing. He would have a know-how of material. He would have a know-how of certain type of proportion. And his sketch, surprisingly, were more algorithmic than many sketches that we have nowadays, because his sketch wouldn't have a precise geometry because they couldn't measure in that way. They had a relationship. So this piece is maybe 3 times that, and then it's got this material that is 2 times heavy, this one, and they would imply this type of relationship. So, well, that I think is a sort of interesting comment on the sort of technique evolution, and will be not, but I still think there is not really somebody that has been addressing this clearly at the city scale in a way. Like there is like Mario has done a lot of work in the construction technique, how it was, how it's becoming the modernist era and the post-modern, but there is not somebody that I found that really addressed that in our discipline at the city scale.
I think in response to your comments, I think I'd like to just kind of get excited about a new age of wonder and enchantment. And I'd actually recommend Stuart Kaufman's Reinventing the Sacred, which is actually a scientific text, which I think is very bold. There's a lot of science in it, because he's Stuart Kaufman, but actually some of the ideas that he has about, with the advent of complexity and the unknown, come a different set of qualities that science doesn't actually have the language for. And so I think within modernity and high modernity, there is this assumption that everything is knowable and everything is reducible to, let's say, empirical observation. But actually, when you think of the basis of computing, so let's think about what computing is for a second. Computing it's a practice of counting. So if we go back to when we first learned to count, what is it that we count? And we count objects. We count bottles, and we count tables, and we can count people in the room. But do we count air? Do we count emotions? Do we count? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So until we can convert those into countable things. So if we're counting air, we have to count the atoms. We atomize it again. And so essentially, the issue is that the kinds of computation that we're engaging in is killing a philosophy of mathematics. There's actually a philosophy of numbers that underpins the practice of mathematics. And by getting stuck in one mode of thinking and practice, we are denying ourselves many other forms of experience. And I think that we're starting to appreciate that that's the position we're in. And so when we do get, eminent scientists like Stuart Kaufman talking about enchantment and wonder and these, kind of other dimensions of experience, and obviously Bateson was, in that space as well, I think we need to pay attention to them. And whilst we may not be able to empiricize it and productize it and value it as a form of capital, I think that, Mark's, discussion about, so what are the other value systems in a secular world that we look to other than money? I mean, what are they? What are the ethics and values and things that we would like to live the principles of our life by? If we don't share a God, and we all have a kind of an individual spirituality, then what else do we share other than money? And I think that's a really, really, really important question, and one that we need to take very seriously.
Thank you. Any other questions? A final question, perhaps? Yep. There's two hands, so hand for you first.
You mentioned the problem with the idea of fixed identity and the mental state in which the reality of fixed identity. And would you consider the reason for why what Mike mentioned, the problem with the city block, is that we ignore the concept in the context of the environment? Would you say, do you think there's a link between the two, and maybe what are the other potential difficulties in implementing the notion of the design that you're proposing in an urban scale?
Well, I think that the healthiest state to be in is one in which our identity is not fixed, both as an individual and as a population. So the question then, how are we engaging environment as being an extension or a factor in shaping that identity? How is that affecting our quality of living or our experience of space? I think it's a very, very important one. And I think that the role of the designer is moving away from just designing an object, and potentially designing the context in which the object is either likely or in some way most... I'm trying to think of the word here, because I don't want to talk about efficiencies, and I don't want to empiricize this, but there's a quality of living that environment provides that allows you to be fluid and not lose your bearings on community and kind of an urban scale of context and feelings of belonging. But on the other hand, gives you the freedom of and liberties to be yourself and feel comfortable with that. So, I mean, I think that someone like Arakawa was even though he was looking at architectures of immortality, is trying to play with that notion of comfort and unfamiliarity to provoke, let's say, new capabilities. And so I think there's something really important. What you're saying is that traditionally, we've left environment to the landscape architects, and that I think that those distinctions are becoming much more blurred. I don't think they're without limits, but I think that each designer will find their own, let's say, kind of portfolio, rhythms, forms of expression within those within their own limits, and I think that would be a very healthy thing.
Every now and then I run a studio, and clearly the one word that is forbidden, at least in my studio, is the word program.
Program.
I mean, this, I think, has done more to damage education, architectural production, than any single concept, prior to that, perhaps apart from the Fenêtre Longueur or the 5 points of Corbusier. I mean, the studio I did a studio a year and a half ago, and you had to pick one material, and you had to build whatever you did out of one material. I mean, it was, if it's stone, then the whole thing is stone. And then people go, well, what about my HVAC? And I go, people lived without HVAC for a gamillion years. I'm not going to do that. Well, then it can't be a studio, because then it doesn't meet NAB regulations. I mean, this is the crap. I mean, I'm talking about, I mean, NAB basically forces architecture schools to perform architecture in a particular way that is completely unimaginative, underinformed, untheorized, philosophically denuded of any kind of self-criticality. Interdisciplinarity is exported, to other types of areas, shockingly.
Yeah, but I think that the question of the lack of fluidity is one of the problems, because still we might address our design with fluidity, might address our personality, but I think still what is required to us is different than that. And so there is a sort of contrast that we need to try and understand how address or frame if we want to change it. Because personally I don't feel comfortable with this type of segregation, but I'm confronted with them every day. So it's a question of how you deal and how do you reframe the system so that you allow fluidity to happen. Of course, we are not anymore in an era in which we have a fluidity of personality. We are close in a mental health hospital, but there are degrees, no? You can also not be close in a mental health hospital, but there is a questioning of whether fluidity is something that could be part of the system or not, whether it's serious enough or could be validated enough, or is a guarantee enough, or is just something that, change from one moment to the other. We actually quite don't know how to evaluate this, or how to assess it, or how to guarantee it. Guarantee it, for example, when we talk about artifact in the public realm, or how to validate if we talk about academia. There are questions that I think we should start to address if we want to change, and also if we want to change the way we design city and we approach the city. First, we should also change the barrier that are inside of our discipline.
Which is interesting, because it goes up to a discussion about to what extent you need constraint or temporary constraints in order to have enough intelligence to evolve a form. And by form, I mean it might be a legislation, might be a piece of architecture, might be a piece of a movement. And to what extent that usability has its limitation, perhaps inbuilt on the, let's call it system, or let's say practice or collectivity. So I think it's quite interesting that I think today this idea of perhaps the fluidity of identity, or to what extent the idea that when you talk about communities, we don't need to be postmodern or cynical, but at the same time, we don't need to be recoding or retexting. So I think it's a very interesting question, to what extent one can still talk about, with all the research, as the scale tends to go up, to what extent one can still find protocols to create temporary constraints, to create temporary, I don't want to call boxes, but let's call it boxes, temporary nets, where, let's say, we are here today discussing a subject, every person from a very kind of, perhaps has similarities, but different points of view, nevertheless, is still somehow of a base which perhaps generate a different sort of conversation than if you just kind of put four cats. They are kind of...
Well, I don't believe in the four cats, because I think the four cats will find some material constraint and environmental constraint themselves if they are trained to live on that environment and by themselves. You know, what I believe is that culturally we have been over-constructing, constraining. I believe there are constraining in the world, but I'm interested on constraining that exists, in constraint of society, in material constraint, in political constraint. I'm not interested on what the whole substratum of legitimation, validation, constraint that we have built up to secure the society to a certain state. So, and that exists both in the built environment, because half of the work that goes in many prototypes that go in the public realm is work that is done for insurance purposes, not done to work on the real constraint that might be present, or social, economical, or material constraint. And similarly happen in academia with the validation of your work that need to be done in specific constraint most of the time, and it's difficult to discuss across this constraint. So I'm really in favor of constraint, but they need to be constraint embedded in a milieu. I have the impression there are constraints that are being superimposed, but that's my view.
No, but I think the point is that I was mentioning constraint as a projective, not as the lex, the law, which is constantly bind you to what is the preconception of that. I think it's interesting to think of constraints, of how we form new constraints, because I think that is, so it doesn't become just an uncharacteristic field.
I mean, what I'd say about that is I think that architecture is responding to the needs of the time, and at the moment we perceive the need for change, which requires a condition of fluidity and kind of adaptiveness and a capacity to absorb and assimilate, experiment and propose, as opposed to analyze and obey orders and kind of conform. And that's not to say that in 50 years' time, we won't go back into a phase where we need to consolidate and formalize and streamline and synergize in some way so that practices are much more similar. But I think right now the condition we're facing is that, look, we're stuck in a way of producing architecture and spaces which are environmentally damaging, and we are concerned about that as a global community. So if we don't embrace a degree of fluidity in our self-critique, but also in the stories that architecture tells about itself and about what it's about. So I think you were saying this, there was a kind of a need for a language that comes, from the discipline itself, a kind of self-critique to tell the story of to architects and to non-architects about what it is that we're collectively attempting. And that doesn't mean that we have to do it all in the same way, and it doesn't mean that we have to do it all differently. But I think there's a meta-narrative that's not yet emerged. I think that we're all kind of wrestling with for a bit, but I think that the condition in which we're rooted is change. And that's what we're responding to.
I can add one more little, once again, footnote to that. We have something called Department of Architecture and Department of Urban Planning. I don't know, do we have planners here somewhere?
Yes.
No, not really. Okay.
Yeah.
And I gave a talk, and then someone interviewed me and said, by the way, we're making a new department here, and we don't know what to call it because we think about calling it, environmental studies. And my eyeballs rolled and so like that. So, some people wanted to call it architecture, and so I said, well, what'd you do it? I mean, how would you, that question to me was, how would I call this new department? So I said, well, you can't use the word architecture, that comes from the Greeks. And I'm just sick and tired, once again, of, the Greeks who invented anthro, the very idea of man at the center of the damn universe, that we go to them again. So let's just not use that word, and then we can't use urban, because that comes from the damn Romans, right? So we're stuck, right? So, I mean, as the Dean of the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, right? I went to the faculty meeting, of course, and they were very worried I'm going to change the name that's etched onto the frieze of this building. Don't worry, I have no idea what to call it, so I just said let's call it, blah blah gaboo, and just invent a new word, and whatever that is, it's a blah blah bagoo association, right? Get the word of the A, get it off the damn name. And let's just start with something and say, okay, yeah, well, architecture on the old word is still, we're not, saying it's not there, but maybe it's cities, maybe it's planning, maybe it's terraforming, maybe it's bio thingamabob, let's just sit around and do shit. And, we always get sort of caught up in the question, is it architecture or not? Or is it urban or not? And these are completely irrelevant concepts today, completely, Okay, another rant.
It's good.
It's interesting that sometimes we have a discussion during the pre-RIBA visit
I would be so embarrassed.
if what is architecture is what the RIBA wants.
I mean, I would find, I might get, strung up here, but, architectural association, that word is coming to an end. I'm warning you.
Well, the brand is okay.
We throw it into a Freudian coach.
What can I say? I'm leaving tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm out of here.
I know where his hotel is. It's okay. I think we have one last question.
My question also has to do with all this constraint and restriction, but I'll just rephrase it to make myself clear. But so today we've been talking about these innovative ways of making by merging different materials such as technology and some sort of organic, alive matter to then apply it into spaces that allows humans to interact with it. So far this practice has been approached as some work in progress or experiments or exhibitions, but the question is, do you see this way of making becoming more and more active in the coming years? And maybe the restriction, it's not talking about the materials or the technology, but more this social or human acceptance to it, in a way?
I'll take that if that's as a kick-off. So I mean, the first building that's incorporating these kinds of elements has been already built. So that's Arup's BIQ, the intelligent building for the International Building Association. It was opened in November 2014 to the public. And so what it has is a series of algae facades on the outside. And they look like giant inverted lava lamps. So you see these bubbles of air going up through like jellyfish within this green landscape, like an aquarium, a kind of a flat aquarium on the outside of the buildings. These aquariums are not part of the structural support of the building. They are literally like almost like shutters that are wrapped around the building. And so this is a kind of a quarters, so these are private residences, and these green facades or shadings simply use the solar thermal effect to reduce the heat of the building during the summer. There's talk about harvesting these algae, turning them into composts or biofuels, there's many, many different kinds of things. And you can think of them as being next generation urban farming, where you're actually using the productivity of the microcellular world to generate these kinds of experiences and opportunities. You've also got practices like studio architects, which are based in Waterloo, or they were based in Waterloo. So they're looking at bioluminescence as being part of building experiences. They were also designing a school in Twickenham where the algae installation there was actually, part of, the students thinking about sustainability, how does green matter be transformed into different kinds of social opportunities. And I think that was like at a Swedish school or something. So it's happening, so this isn't, a far fiction. Where it will become controversial is I've just won a project for 3.2 million euro for the Horizon 2020, and it's looking at processing biomass produced by a consortium of bacteria and algae, and in situ, using robotics and kind of a hydraulic processing, it will produce clean water, remove phosphate, which is in short supply now, and create a next generation kind of soap. So, this is a living architecture, so it'd be like an installation in the middle of the room, like a partition. It's not a structural system. And so the work on this will start about April 2014, and will go on to about April 2017. So these things are actually being developed. What we haven't got are the big narratives as to, how this becomes part of a socio-economic kind of meaningful exchange. You always get it reduced down to, oh, well, you haven't produced enough phosphate for it to be commercially viable. It's like, well... so it's future advanced, technologies, but these things are possible. The ethical issue will be, what challenges we'll have thinking about how we metabolic design and use genetic engineering in these spaces. So we're going to have to think very carefully about procurement. How these organisms get into the space, how they're removed from the space, how we make sure that they don't contaminate anything. All of these things are actually part of the construction of these things. And as long as we don't forget to address them, then I think this is actually part of our learning. We don't know the answers to these at the outset, but what we do want to do is to open up opportunities for critique, theoretical as much as design-led critique, and start to actually immerse ourselves in the possibilities.
But I have the impression we need a sort of catastrophe or revolution, though, because like the erasure transformation, IOTM, how it was called, erasure transformation modification, the Pasquian environment. So basically, because as Rachel said, there are a lot of prototypes, like the new folly will be in a public space in Portugal, will be effectively part of a everyday environment for a lot of people, and there is Arup that did something, there is a PS1 that was done with mycelium, there are a lot of things happening, and also exhibitions are an environment, to a certain extent. So there are a lot of things happening, but we need to be careful because we might be doing all of this effort and all of this discussion, and then when they kick off, they just become part of the system like PV panel and all the rest. And that will be just killing all the work we have done until now. And I think there is a sort of radical change of the system that it was quite interesting because it was really in the air today, also the conversation of there is no anymore urban design and there is architecture, the segregation between category and etc. But we need to rethink the system. We need to have a different system where this prototype can plug in. If the system is not changed, and I don't know how we can change it, I'm really struggling because alone I can't change it. I will never win. It requires thousands of people, millions probably, to change the system. So that we don't talk anymore about, biology, computation, we don't talk anymore about, the sustainability issue and etc., but we talk about something else. We talk about this more fluid identity of both Howard and of the building, and we find new way eventually of validating that. While he was talking about architecture and urban design and the discipline, it was coming to my mind where I grew up in one of these pre-industrial community in Italy, and somehow the people there were not identified because they were a carpenter or because they were good or because they were somebody that saw linen, or it was writing, or it was a painter. There was no such a category. People would be identified by their name, and they would be trusted because they were doing a mix of stuff, generic stuff that just Pinin, wherever, his name could do, right? And so his character will be fluid. You will know it. And people, by seeing him every day, will know what he can do and what actually is better he doesn't do, you know? And wouldn't be because it's in a generic category, it will be through pattern recognition, you know? But it's good to discuss that, but I'm not sure, not even a single bit, how we really can implement that or bring these changes to actually be actualized so that the prototype that we throw there and that are not simply carrying bacteria or other elements and try to use them, but try to make a sort of a different type of change, can have an impact and won't be absorbed by this segregation and industrialization of the product.
Yeah, I'd like to follow that up because I honestly think that a change in infrastructure is going to be the catalyst. And that doesn't mean that we have to change centralized infrastructures. I think I have a lot of faith and optimism in maker community and these kind of small scale the small-scale local prototype, exactly the kind of thing that you're doing, Claudia. I mean, because I think that the change isn't going to be that hegemony where we go, you know, from the industrial age all the way over to parametricism or you know, the ecocene. What we're going to see is an explosion of many different things first. That's what we'll see, and then we will see reconsolidation around communities, technologies, spaces that start to congeal in certain ways. That I think we'll see almost like a Cambrian explosion of possibilities. We're at the stage of that right now. So you know that there aren't the iconic examples that we can easily cite you that say, well, this is the way it's going to be done, because that doesn't exist yet. Your generation might start to produce them. The generation after you will certainly be getting there. And then the likelihood is that we're going to go through another cycle of stuff where all that starts to rearticulate and reorganize into more streamlined modes of existence and inhabitation. You know, we don't know what they are yet. There'll be different kinds of technologies. There'll be different kinds of communities. We'll have different value sets within that. But what we can do is make sure that those spaces, those opportunities are as open as they can be. And I do think that infrastructure is really important to remember. If we are going to make space for living things in cities, we need to embrace our soils. We need to think much more strategically about what waste is. I love the cradle to cradle. I still think it's relatively industrial, and I think that we can go well beyond that in a very, very practical way. And I honestly think that design is part of the rearticulation of a third millennium. I can read your thoughts now.
Well, I think that's, with that statement, I think we can slowly bring the event to an end. It has been a pleasure to host this event, and it brings to my mind one of the poems who actually made me leave Brazil and come to England to study architecture, which actually he's not even Brazilian, he's Portuguese, is Fernando Pessoa. In one of his famous poems called Tabacaria, which means cigar house or shop house or whatever the name that is, where he's saying that what if he goes around a very interesting metaphysics story in this poem, and then he actually at the end he's talking about if he would dream, if the world would be like his dream, it would be pretty sad because everyone would be abiding by his dreams and not everyone else's dreams. So it opens a very interesting question about the necessity of collaboration, the necessity to set up meetings like this to discuss the time as tomorrow, yesterday, after tomorrow and centuries above to see how we can collaborate, how we can exchange views. And I think especially within the school and within and outside the unit for the students as well, how we can continue that long circuit and short circuit of discussions through different intellects, different points of view, and different mindsets. But I would like to really thank our guest speakers. Mike couldn't be with us for the discourse, but also thank Mike, Mark, Claudia, and Rachel. So please help me to thank our speakers. Thank you very much.